Alex? Her voice called out softly, cutting through the stillness of the house. It was a quiet Thursday afternoon, and the silence was almost eerie, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the old clock in the living room. Alex had been sitting alone in the kitchen, absent-mindedly scrolling through his phone, the warm sunlight streaming through the windows making everything feel oddly serene. The house was empty except for him and Elena, his stepsister. Their parents were out, leaving behind a quiet that was both comforting and unsettling. Elena had always been somewhat of a mystery to Alex. They were the same age, but worlds apart in personality. Where he was carefree and spontaneous, she was poised and meticulous. Their lives had always run parallel, polite exchanges at best, but nothing more. Yet recently, things had felt different. He couldn't explain it. There was an energy, a strange tension whenever they were in the same room, as if the air itself was holding its breath. When Elena stepped into the kitchen that day, Alex's pulse quickened. Her casual smile didn't match the spark in her eyes, a look he couldn't quite place. "Hey," she said, leaning against the counter, arms crossed. "Hey," he replied, his voice steady, but his heart anything but. "You've been acting different," she said, tilting her head slightly. "Avoiding me, maybe?" He chuckled nervously, trying to deflect. "Avoiding? No way. Just been busy." "Busy doing nothing?" she teased, her lips curving into a playful grin. Alex tried to keep it light, but her words hit deeper than he expected. Had he been avoiding her? Maybe he had. There was something about her lately, a shift he couldn't quite define. And now, standing there, just a few feet away, that shift was impossible to ignore. "Elena," he started, his voice trailing off. She stepped closer, her gaze fixed on him with an intensity that made his breath hitch. "You don't have to pretend, you know?" Her tone was soft, but her words carried weight. "Pretend what?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Her eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, the room felt impossibly small, the air heavy with something unspoken. She leaned slightly closer, the faint scent of her perfume filling the space between them. "I think you know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Alex swallowed hard, his mind racing. What was this? What was she trying to say? Before he could find the words, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke the spell. Their parents were home. Elena stepped back, her expression unreadable, and the tension in the room evaporated as quickly as it had appeared. "Guess we'll talk later," she said with a sly smile, turning to leave. Alex sat frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. What had just happened? The sound of the car door slamming outside jolted Alex out of his thoughts. His heart was still racing, and his mind was a whirlwind of questions he didn't have answers to. What had just happened? He could still feel the weight of Elena's words, the way she had looked at him, and the unspoken tension that hung in the air between them. It was as if the moment had left an invisible mark, one he couldn't shake off. He heard the front door open, followed by the familiar voices of his dad and Catherine, their laughter filling the house. Alex took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. It was as if the normalcy of their return could somehow erase what had just transpired in the kitchen. "Elena!" "Alex, we're back," Catherine called out cheerfully. Elena's voice echoed from somewhere upstairs. "Hey, welcome back." She sounded perfectly normal, her tone light and casual, as if nothing had happened. Alex shook his head, trying to do the same. He grabbed his phone and made his way to the living room, planting himself on the couch and flipping through channels as though he hadn't a care in the world. But his mind was anything but calm. Catherine peeked into the living room, her arms full of shopping bags.
"Hey, Alex."
"All good here?" "Yeah, all good," he replied, forcing a smile.
"Great."
"Dinner's in a couple of hours." "I'll call you when it's ready," she said, disappearing into the kitchen. Alex nodded, though she was already out of sight. He could hear his dad unloading groceries, the clinking of bags and cabinets opening and closing. It was all so normal. Too normal. And then there was Elena, upstairs, out of sight, yet somehow still lingering in his thoughts. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them, something he wasn't sure he understood or was ready to face. The rest of the evening passed uneventfully, but Alex felt like he was on autopilot. Dinner was filled with small talk and laughter, yet he couldn't focus. Elena sat across from him, her demeanor calm and composed. She laughed at their dad's jokes, commented on Catherine's plans for the weekend, and seemed completely unbothered. But every so often, Alex would catch her glancing at him. Just a fleeting moment, but enough to make his stomach twist. Was she doing this on purpose? Or was he imagining it? Later that night, as Alex lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the day's events replayed in his mind. He couldn't escape the memory of Elena's voice, her words echoing in his head. "You don't have to pretend, you know." What had she meant by that? Pretend what? And why now? Their lives had been so separate for so long. Why was this happening? He turned over, pulling the blanket tighter around himself, but sleep wouldn't come. The questions kept swirling, unanswered and relentless. And then, just as he was on the verge of drifting off, he heard it, a soft knock at his door. The soft knock startled Alex, pulling him back from the edge of sleep. His room was dark, the faint glow of the moonlight casting shadows across the walls. For a moment, he thought he'd imagined it. But then, there it was again, a quiet, deliberate tap that sent a chill down his spine. "Alex." Elena's voice was barely a whisper on the other side of the door. He hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. What could she possibly want at this hour? Everything in him screamed to stay silent, pretend he hadn't heard her. But before he could decide, the doorknob turned slightly, the door creaking open just enough for her to peek inside. "Are you awake?" she asked softly, her silhouette framed by the dim hallway light. Caught, Alex sat up, running a hand through his hair to buy himself a moment. "Yeah, what's up?" he said, his voice thick with hesitation. Elena stepped inside, closing the door gently behind her. She leaned against it, her arms crossed, looking unusually unsure of herself. It was a stark contrast to the confident, teasing girl from earlier. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted, her gaze flickering to the floor before meeting his. Alex shifted uncomfortably, the air in the room suddenly feeling heavier. "Okay," and he asked, trying to keep his tone casual despite the tightness in his chest. She let out a quiet sigh, stepping further into the room. I feel like we need to talk." "About earlier?" His stomach tightened at her words. This was the conversation he'd been dreading all evening. "There's nothing to talk about," he replied quickly, his voice sharper than he intended. "It was nothing. Let's just forget it." Her eyes narrowed slightly, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Nothing? Is that what you really think, Alex?" He opened his mouth to argue, but found himself at a loss for words. Because deep down, he knew she was right. It wasn't nothing. But admitting that felt like stepping into dangerous, uncharted territory, and he wasn't sure he was ready for where it might lead. "Elena, it's late," he said instead, his voice quieter now. "We should both just get some sleep." She didn't move, her gaze locked on him. "You can keep pretending if you want," she said softly, her tone carrying a hint of frustration. "But we both know something's changed. You can't ignore it forever." The weight of her words hung in the air, pressing down on him like a physical force. He wanted to deny it, to brush her off and end the conversation. But the look in her eyes stopped him. There was something raw there, something vulnerable, and it made his chest ache in a way he couldn't quite explain. "I don't know what you want me to say," he admitted finally, his voice barely audible. She took a step closer, her expression softening. "I don't want you to say anything," she whispered. "I just want you to be honest." Before he could respond, the faint creak of a floorboard echoed from the hallway outside. Both of them froze, their eyes darting to the door. Someone else was awake. The creak of the floorboard hung in the silence, like a warning, and Alex felt his breath catch in his throat. His eyes darted to Elena, who was standing just a few feet away, her expression frozen in a mix of fear and guilt. For a moment, neither of them moved, the tension in the room tightening like a noose. "Someone's awake," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Alex nodded, his mind racing. If their dad or Catherine walked in now, There would be questions, questions he wasn't prepared to answer. His heart hammered in his chest as he gestured for Elena to move toward the bed. "Get down," he hissed, keeping his voice low. "What?" she whispered back, her brows knitting in confusion. "Just hide or something," he muttered, motioning more urgently. Elena hesitated for a split second before crouching down beside the bed, her movements quick and quiet. Alex swung his legs over the side, trying to look casual as he grabbed his phone from the nightstand and pretended to scroll through it. The faint sound of footsteps drew closer, slow and deliberate, each one sending a fresh wave of panic through him. The door creaked open slightly, and Alex forced himself to look up, his expression deliberately groggy. It was his dad, standing in the dim light of the hallway, his figure partially obscured by the shadows. "You okay, son?" his dad asked, his voice low but tinged with curiosity. Alex cleared his throat, doing his best to sound normal. "Yeah, just couldn't sleep." "What's up?" His dad lingered in the doorway for a moment, his eyes scanning the room. Alex's pulse quickened as he willed himself to stay calm, to act like nothing was out of the ordinary. "Thought I heard voices," his dad said after a pause. "Must have been dreaming." Alex forced a chuckle, shaking his head.
Yeah, probably.
"Just me here." His dad nodded slowly, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He glanced around the room once more before stepping back into the hallway. "All right. Try to get some rest." "Will do," Alex replied, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. The door closed with a soft click, and the footsteps receded down the hall. Alex waited until the silence returned before letting out a shaky breath. He glanced down at Elena, who was still crouched beside the bed, her eyes wide and filled with a mix of relief and nervous energy. "You need to leave," he whispered, his tone firm. Elena stood slowly, brushing her hair back from her face. "That was close," she said, her voice unsteady but laced with a hint of something else. "Excitement?" "Too close," Alex shot back. "What were you thinking coming in here like that?" "I told you," she said, stepping closer. "We need to talk." "Not here, not now," he said, his frustration barely contained. But Elena didn't back down. Instead, she leaned in, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Alex, you can keep running from this, but it's not going away. You know it, and I know it." Before he could respond, a sudden noise from the hallway, a door closing, louder this time, made both of them freeze. Someone was definitely still awake. The sharp sound of the door closing sent a jolt through Alex and Elena. His breath hitched as he stared at her, the gravity of their situation sinking in. Someone was awake, and every second they stayed like this increased the risk of being caught. "You need to go now," Alex whispered harshly, his voice barely audible. Elena hesitated, her lips pressing together as if she wanted to argue. But the urgency in Alex's eyes silenced her. With a quick nod, she turned toward the door, moving as quietly as she could. Alex followed her to make sure the hallway was clear. His heart raced as he cracked the door open just enough to peek out. The house was still, the faint glow of a nightlight casting long shadows on the walls. He gestured for her to go, and she slipped out, her movements as silent as a ghost. Alex stood frozen for a moment, listening intently for any sound of movement. But all he heard was the faint ticking of the clock in the living room. He closed the door softly and leaned against it, letting out a shaky breath. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, emotions, and questions. What was he doing? What were they doing? It all felt so surreal, like he was trapped in someone else's story. He climbed back into bed, but sleep was out of the question. The weight of what had almost happened, and what could still happen, pressed heavily on him. He knew they were playing with fire, and it was only a matter of time before they got burned. The next morning came too quickly. Alex barely managed to pull himself together as he joined the family for breakfast. His dad was reading the paper, Catherine was scrolling through her phone, and Elena, she was sitting across from him, her expression unreadable. "Sleep well, Alex?" his dad asked without looking up from the paper. "Yeah," Alex lied, forcing a smile. "Must have been a restless night for everyone," Catherine chimed in. "I thought I heard someone moving around," Alex's stomach dropped, but he kept his face neutral. Probably just the house settling, he said casually. Catherine murmured, clearly unconvinced. Elena's gaze flicked to him for the briefest moment, a hint of tension in her eyes. But she said nothing, instead focusing on her plate as if the conversation didn't involve her. The day passed in a blur, with Alex avoiding Elena as much as possible. But by evening, he knew they needed to talk. He couldn't keep pretending nothing was happening. When he finally found her in the backyard, she was sitting on the porch steps, her expression distant. He hesitated before stepping closer. "Elena," he started, his voice low. She looked up, and for the first time, he saw something in her eyes he hadn't expected: regret. "This isn't right," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know," he replied, his chest tightening. For a moment, they just stared at each other, the unspoken connection between them still there but overshadowed by the weight of reality. And then, as if on cue, the back door opened. Their dad stepped out, his expression a mix of curiosity and concern. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice sharp. Alex froze, his mind racing for an explanation. But before he could say anything, Elena stood up, her face calm and composed. "Nothing," she said, her tone steady. "We were just talking about school stuff." Their dad's eyes lingered on them for a moment, his expression unreadable. But then he nodded, seemingly satisfied. "All right. Dinner's in an hour." As he went back inside, Elena turned to Alex, her lips curving into a faint smile. "We're going to be okay," she said softly. But as she walked away, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't over. Something still lingered, just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. The house was quieter than usual that evening, the kind of silence that carries weight, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Alex sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his hands. His thoughts were a tangle of emotions, confusion, guilt, and something he couldn't quite name. The events of the past few days felt like a blur, a series of moments that had shifted everything he thought he understood about his life. Elena had been calm when their dad interrupted them, her ability to keep her composure under pressure both impressive and unsettling. But Alex knew that calmness didn't mean resolution. It didn't mean they had figured out what this was between them or what to do about it. A quiet knock on his door broke through his thoughts. He tensed for a moment before answering. "Come in." Elena stepped inside, her expression softer than before, almost hesitant. She closed the door behind her and leaned against it, her arms crossed. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steady but quieter than usual. Alex nodded, his throat dry. "Yeah, we do." She moved closer, sitting on the chair by his desk, leaving a deliberate space between them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, heavy with everything they didn't know how to say. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice careful, "about everything. About us." Alex swallowed hard, bracing himself. "And?" She looked at him, her eyes full of emotion, regret, maybe, or something close to it. "This isn't who we are," she said softly. "We're not like this. We can't let whatever this is ruin everything. Our family, our lives, it's too important." He nodded slowly, her words cutting through the fog in his mind. Deep down, he knew she was right. They had let a strange, fleeting connection blur the lines between them, but those lines were there for a reason. "I know," he said finally, his voice low. "I've been thinking the same thing." She smiled faintly, a sad sort of smile. "It's not easy though, is it?" "No," he admitted. "It's not." They sat in silence again, but this time it felt different. It wasn't the tense, unspoken energy from before. It was something quieter, more resolved. "I think we should just move on," Elena said eventually. "Focus on what's important. Family, school, everything else." It was a mistake, Alex." He nodded, feeling the truth of her words settle into his chest.
Yeah.
"It was." She stood, lingering for a moment, as though she wanted to say more. But then she smiled again, this time a little brighter. "We'll be okay," she said, her tone confident now. As she left the room, Alex felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. The tension that had been building for weeks was gone, but so was something else, something fragile and fleeting that they had both chosen to let go. That night, as he lay in bed, he thought about Elena's words. She was right. They couldn't change what had happened, but they could choose what came next. And for the first time in days, Alex felt a sense of peace. Sometimes, the hardest choices are the ones that keep us grounded.